first speaker, Charles Trimble, former Executive Director of NCAI, shares his deep regrets that he is unable to be with us today. We are grateful that he has shared his speech with Frank Ducheneau, who will read it for all of us here. Frank Ducheneau is the former Executive Director serving in 1970 for NCAI. Thank you to Mr. Ducheneau. Please join us.
Thank you. I'm very proud and happy to be asked by Chuck to read his speech here. I really am sorry. I talked to Chuck yesterday, and his doctor advised him that he probably shouldn't be flying around the country for a certain condition he has right now. But he did want me to indicate how sorry he was he wouldn't be able to be here to give this talk to you and see his old friends, some of his old friends and colleagues around the place. So they've allotted him and me 30 minutes, and I'll begin. I may, at a couple points, interject my own comments, but I'll let you know. Chuck has indicated, or has titled his speech, Honoring the Past, and it begins. According to the program, the subject of this keynote is honoring the past, and I will try to do just that. But I think it's important and wise to define what honoring the past entails, and I offer to follow. To honor the past is to recall the great and good people. First, those heroes who dreamed and designed and founded this great organization over 3/4 of a century ago. But it's also important to recall the non-heroes who made the organization work through the years, including the elected officers and many who have served year after year without acknowledgement and so often without thanks, especially those in the committee rooms and elsewhere during the convention and meeting of the NCAI. And over the years, many of you older than me have seen young people making the meetings work behind the scenes, and they never get recognition, and I think Chuck wanted to make sure they did, including those who are here. To honor the past is to recall the great accomplishments, mainly the bringing together and holding together the tribes in some long struggles for sovereignty and jurisdiction for the rights of the tribes, be they land rights, water rights, hunting and fishing rights, and most of all, the right to self-determination and self-government. To honor the past is to recognize and recall the faults and problems, especially the internal problems that often, from time to time, threaten the very existence of NCAI, and to learn more from the past, and to not let problems fester and rot the soul of NCAI and untreated. So let us hold these goals in our hearts, because I cannot address them adequately in the 30 minutes that is allotted for this talk. In preparing my talk, I read from several books the accounts of the founding of this organization, especially by the book by W. Cowger, C-O-W-G-E-R, entitled The National Congress of American Indians, The Founding Years. It is an excellent book and should be required reading on the part of the officers, executive committee, and the staff. And this is the first time I've heard of the book, and I'll try and get a copy of it. It's a story of great Indian men and women, visionaries who in 1943 likely saw the end of the World War II would mean the nations would return to the development of industry and the boundless growth of population. And like at the end of the Civil War of 1860s, such growth and expansion would usually mean that much of it would be at the cost of Indian tribes, their lands, and national resources. They knew that the tribes must be prepared, organized with a national front. Now, regardless of what anyone might think of Commissioner John Collier or the the Indian New Deal, or the Indian Reorganization Act, Collier sought to modernize the tribes and formalize tribal governments as a means of saving them in the face of an ever-growing onslaught to finish the goal of manifest destiny. That is, to disappear the Indians and to seize their land and resources in the name of the building of the nation. And probably just older people like me would know about Collier, the Indian New Deal, and the Indian Reorganization Act. It might be interesting to check into it. To meet the coming threat, a national Indian organization would be needed. Such an organization was a logical follow-on to the Indian Reorganization Act and would be much facilitated by the standardization of the tribes brought about by the IRA. It was in Collier's DIA in 1942 and 43 that the design of NCAI was carried out by Indian scholars and leaders brought on board by Collier. He encouraged political activism on the part of Indian employees in the Bureau, and they would meet periodically to discuss tribal issues and, of course, a national Indian organization. This group of heroes included Archie Finney, Nez Perce, Darcy McNichol, Flathead, Charles Heacock, Rosebud Lakota, Ben White, Oklahoma Choctaw, David Dozier, Flathead, Mark Burns and George Lamont, Chippewa, and not least of all, Ruth Muscat Bronson, Cherokee. That was in the early 1940s, at the outset of World War II, when the BI's central office was moved to Chicago. The war effort required much office space in the District of Columbia, and there was no Pentagon in those days, so lesser programs such as Indian Affairs were relocated to other cities for the duration of the war. Helen Peterson, Oglala Lakota, and I remember Helen very well, who along with Ruth Muscat Bronson was the greatest NCAI executive director in the organization's history, followed, I think, by Chuck Trimble, having led NCAI through the termination fight in the 1950s. In a 1971 nostalgic article for the NCAI Sentinel, she wrote the following, quote, "With the support of John Collier, a small group of Bureau employees traveled from tribe to tribe in 1944, selling the idea of a national intertribal organization." Continuing the quote. Darcy McNichol, one of the founders of the organization, was heard to relate that on the evening before the start of the first convention, he and his Indian colleagues sat anxiously on the mezzanine in the Cosmopolitan Hotel, I believe that was in this city, the hotel where the convention was to be held. They wondered if 10 tribal delegates or 100 would show up, or none at all. Continuing the quote, "When the first obviously Indian delegate at Paiute entered the hotel lobby, they rushed to the door to fall on that first Indian who would make their dream come true." Continuing the quote. Later in that convention, at a high point of the meeting, one of the delegates let go with a blood-curdling war cry and caused pandemonium among the lily-white moving north delegates in another meeting next door, who undoubtedly thought the Indians were on the warpath. End of the quote. Thus began the magnificent organization that we celebrate today on the 75th anniversary of its history. NCAI was to face financial problems from the start and operated on a shoestring for most of its first 50 years, although it was successful in several areas. Ready or not, they hit the ground running, as the saying goes, and they notched up successes in securing voting rights for the tribes in the Southwest, where the states of Arizona and New Mexico attempted to hold hostage Indian voting rights unless the tribe would surrender their right to jurisdiction and their sovereign immunity to taxing the tribe's citizens in their lands. Early portents of the termination. Of course, we see voter suppression still going on by non-Indians. That's an intersection. NCI brought attention to Alaska Natives for their claims and their rights as citizens. And they set out to secure a court of claims for tribes to secure justice and recompense for the lands illegally taken from them for over a century. This was enacted as the Indian Claims Commission. But their biggest and noblest effort came about when in 1953 House Concurrent Resolution 108 was enacted, which stated, quote, "At the earliest possible time, all of the Indian tribes and the individual members thereof located within the states of California, Florida, New York, and Texas should be freed from federal supervision and control, and all disabilities and limitations specifically applicable to Indians." That was the beginning of the era known as termination. And I would imagine a lot of the younger people here don't remember the terror that it had for tribes. It was in the earliest days of NCAI, and it fell to the new NCAI president, Joseph Gary of Coeur d'Alene. Excuse me. To effect, they organized without any resources a campaign to meet the threat of termination. The push of Congress to dissolve tribal governments, liquidate tribal land and resources, and then jurisdiction over their territories and citizens to the states. Gary was newly elected in the 1953 Phoenix Convention and was driving across the country to Washington, D.C. following the convention in Phoenix. He invited Helen Peterson, her mother and little son, to travel with him. This gave the new NCAI president and executive director much time to talk political strategy and fundraising plans to meet the termination threat. They zigzagged across the country, visiting tribes, talking about what termination was and what its effect on the tribes would mean. Too many tribes fell to termination, and many were crippled by other legislation, such as Public Law 83-280, which gave certain state governments jurisdiction over tribal lands. Nevertheless, termination was stymied and eventually reversed, and much of the credit goes to NCAI and its having rallied the tribes to fight it. No new legislation or executive policy change is beneficial to the Indian tribes and people can never be claimed by any single person or organization. But NCAI, even with its historic chronic shortage of funds, was able to bring together the tribes and Indian organizations to devise strategy and carry out campaigns to support good legislation and to defeat legislation or policies harmful to them. As to internal power struggles and other organizational dysfunction, there are a couple worth mentioning here, and I lived through these. At the end of 1950, such an uprising arose when members of the executive committee, led by young activists, succeeded in overthrowing the Gary Peterson team by accusing them of unsubstantiated financial offenses against the organization. However, after the young activist took over the reins of the executive directorship, he continued his attacks against Gary and Peterson, and the internal discord continued for the next 4 years. That was in the promising Camelot years of the Kennedy administration. But instead of taking advantage of that window of opportunity for legislative and policy changes, the organization was hampered by infighting and bickering. In 1964, the new director declined to issue a call to convention letter to each of the members of the tribe as required by the NCAI Constitution. The executive committee then called for an executive council meeting, I think it was in Gillette, Wyoming. By the executive council meeting of all the member tribes, and the new director was forced to resign and was replaced by Vine Deloria Jr., who put the organization back in order and financial stability. There were Indian leaders of the past who would be very surprised to see that NCAI had even survived into the 21st century. For you see, almost 40 years ago, at the beginning of 1970, NCAI encountered a new death experience. And I think it would be good for us to revisit that time to see how internal dysfunction can threaten NCAI. But let's go back to the late 1960s when NCAI was shaken by political movements that were developing in the urban Indian communities around the country. Militancy was coming into Indian affairs. brought on initially by a new generation of highly educated activists, and then other militant leaders emerged in urban areas around the country. The NCAI convention increasingly came under attack by Indian activists who often disrupted sessions and took to the stage to rail against NCAI leaders as sellouts for not taking a more militant stand against the federal government. The conventions were always fully democratic functions, and the floor was generally open to any Indian individual who paid a modest membership dues and registration fees. The new activists saw this as a ready forum to air their radical views. The first convention that was disrupted was in 1969 in Albuquerque, and I was there. Resulted in considerable damage to the host hotel. At that convention, the militants made inroads when the Executive Council elected an executive director, a young leader, and one of the founders of the National Indian Youth Council, the organization that spearheaded the new Indian militancy. The attitude of that new director and his staff pretty much reflected the general attitude among young militants, one of disrespect for older leaders whom they considered sellouts and pawns of the federal government. Following a year of gross mismanagement and profligacy, the organization was in deep financial trouble and losing member tribes. At the 1970 convention in Anchorage, Alaska, NCAI leaders suspended the agenda and sat before an empty stage in General Assembly, refusing to sit through any more programs until they received a financial report from the director. No such report was delivered and the director was voted out. Then an executive council meeting held in Washington in January 1971, Leo Vasu of the Ogallala Sioux, a longtime member of NCI, was brought in and given the honest job of trying to save the organization. NCI was deeply in debt, including thousands in back taxes. I was elected executive director in Anchorage. I really feel kind of an imposter to be called a former executive director because of those financial problems. I presented an ultimatum to the tribal people to deal with the finances or I resign. That damn Bangalore put me up to They refused to speak up, and I resigned. I was executive director for all of about a month and a half. But they brought in Leo Vasu, as Chuck has said, and he did a damn good job in bringing NCI back. His predecessor's arrogance and mismanagement in seeing the tribal dues being wasted turned many tribal leaders at this time, and several pulled their tribes out of the organization, drastically reducing revenue. The depleted staff struggled to keep up with the preponderance of new legislation introduced in the waning years of the Johnson administration and the early years of the Nixon administration. Chuck got just another page reporter. In addition, the proliferation of new Indian special interest organizations was luring away tribal convention attendees, whereas in the past, the NCI convention was a single major annual event in Indian politics. Conferences were now being held throughout the year by new, better-funded Indian organizations. The well-funded National Congress of American Indian Opportunity, office in the White House complex, and with better entree to the higher levels of the federal departments, was replacing NCI as the base of operation for many tribal delegates coming to the nation's capital. This trend provided the impetus to the formation of the National Tribal Chairmen's Association. Young militant Indian leaders were attracting national press coverage with their dramatics and rhetoric, and with NCI politically and financially weakened, some tribal leaders and federal agencies saw NTCA as the answer to the problems of who speaks for the tribes. The prevailing attitude among the core of NTCA founders was that the NCI was no longer valid and should be discredited or destroyed. The future looked bleak for NCI, and many Indian Affairs observers gave little odds that the organization would even survive the year. A short time after that, I went up on the Hill as counsel on Indian Affairs, and I saw the split between NCI and the NTCA and others, and it was a very dangerous time for this organization. But the organization survived, thanks much to Leo Masu's quiet leadership and austerity measures. Then the organization rallied through the 1970s, spurred on by exciting new legislative initiatives outlined in President Nixon's famous Indian message to Congress. Even the great white backlash of 76 and 77, which saw the rise of state-level anti-tribal groups, helped NCAI cause. Their action resulted in 14 separate pieces of legislation in the 95th Congress calling for reversing Indian hunting and fishing rights, terminating federal tribal relations, and abrogating the Indian treaties. NCAI put together a national strategy to counter the work of the Indian State Congress for Equal Rights and Responsibilities, the national organization created to lead this backlash. In several key meetings, NCAI was able to pull together Indian political and legal organizations such as the Native American Rights Fund, AIM, and NTCA from the far opposition of Indian politics. In an emergency meeting in Phoenix, the strategy was endorsed by the tribes, and many of the tribes pledged significant contributions to finance the battle under the banner of the Ad Hoc United Effort Trust. NCAI pulled Indian country together, and the backlash was defeated, including every piece of anti-tribal legislation that came out of the movement. It is interesting to note that the principal sponsors of those pieces of backlash legislation were also defeated in the following re-election campaign. NCAI fought its way out of the jaws of death and back into the heart and trust of Indian country. I have noted several times in published columns and in speeches that my tenure as executive director of NCAI was truly the high point of my life, the greatest honor. And I was fortunate to have served through a most prolific decade in the enactment of legislation for new policies and programs and resources, as well as executive actions favorable to Indian tribes and off-reservation Indian communities. It was a truly historic era, eclipsed perhaps with what happened in the Obama administration. It is amazing to me how far Indian country has come and its relationship with the federal government and its presence in the nation's capital. In the Obama administration, there were annual meetings with the President himself, direct access to the highest office in the administration, and having the President of the National Congress of American Indians presenting an annual State of the Indian Nations address, answered in turn by a member of Congress. All these developments were very impressive. I share the joy with all of you in the 75th year of NCAI's existence, and the pride of having had the honor to serve the organization. Many puts in caps. God bless NCAI, the greatest organization ever. I'll just take 2 minutes here and say that my first NCAI convention was in 1966. And over the years, I attended almost every NCAI convention into the 90s. It's encouraging to be here today. When I first started, 850 meeting with the General Assembly would not be so heavily attended for various reasons. But I enjoyed my association with NCAI, and I hope that it hangs together in the face of any new dissension. Thank you very much. Woo!